So I hope we got a title that kind of catches your interest. The first time I used the idea of lichens as kind of a historical perspective was on a field trip near Wenatchee, Washington, and we went out there and we looked at kind of differences in the sites and spent the day reading that landscape, looking at the different vegetation types and what had happened, and the terracing of the slopes by wildlife and livestock and around stock ponds, and it was quite interesting. So I thought it kind of gives you a little idea, because oftentimes what we're talking about today, energy, is a secondary impact on the land. We've had the impacts of our native wildlife, for good or for bad, sometimes concentrated, sometimes high deer populations really change forb densities, sometimes bulbs, like in Western Oregon, people will fence their property from deer, and all these interesting bulbs start appearing from nowhere. They've been growing, but the wildlife have been eating them. The more likely conflict are usually livestock grazing. And then we put another layer of energy on top of that. And I would just want to share with you what I see as some of the impacts that energy do on these soils. Here's a kind of soils from kind of around the Colorado Plateau. And what I want to talk about are kind of this impact on biological soil crusts. Lichens are just one of those. Mosses are another important one, and mosses really make for a little better indoor-outdoor carpeting. They're a little tougher than lichens. Lichens, they're kind of fragile, not only physically, but as far as recovery rates. A lot of times bryophytes have much quicker recovery rates. But in this photo you can see, some range people might say, oh, this is all bare ground, but it's all biological soil crusts. And most of range management has really failed to recognize the role of biological soil crusts. And I'll try to show why that's really happened. Actually, Utah State, Neil West, who when he was here, he's retired from Utah State, he was one of the few hardcore range guys who really recognized biological soil crusts and tried to have people manage for them. So that's kind of interesting. But overall, I think one of the failures of range management is recognizing a major component in the rangelands. And really, this is why sage grouse are in such a bad shape right now, in my opinion. Those crusts are slowly replaced by cheatgrass. Now, to give you a background on that, of course, every system's different. Collectively in the Intermountain Basin, we have in the drier habitats. Up in the forest, this isn't true, but in the, say, below 16 inches precip, you've got a major component of biological soil crust, and it's really more of a desert grassland. Even though BLM, my agency, tries to, think that it's Midwest prairie grasses and we graze buffalo on it, it really didn't evolve that way. It's a very fragile crust. And it's really the only time it tolerates a lot of compressional forces are when the soils are moist, okay? Not saturated, but moist, okay? Then it kind of gives and takes. Most of you probably have experience with that, But every system's different. And these deer and elk and antelope, they were mostly trampling on these crusts when they were in the winter and early spring. They'll follow the green line up the mountain and give the crust time to recover. So here's your in contrast, like a Midwest prairie or the Great Plains, you didn't have interspaces. You have rhizomatous grasses which enjoyed being grazed. Rhizomatous grasses increase when you graze them, So bunch grasses are quite different, and you got to really think about that in your systems. So this is kind of a little bit of background. Some of you, I don't expect all the mining engineers to be up on biological soil crusts if I was giving a quiz or anything. So we'll go over some of that, but I think they understand these same sorts of things. They stabilize the soil, especially that surface couple millimeters. They contribute nutrients like nitrogen fixer. They're one of the only nitrogen fixers in the desert systems. They really improve water relations and influence vascular plant growth. And I kind of asterisk that and show this experiment. This is a trampling experiment in canyonlands. And you can see, you know, the differences in these soils just from minor trampling. As a review, they really create soil aggregates. They help prevent erosion, and they increase surface roughness. And you notice it's not all just lichens. Here it's like cyanobacteria, filaments. Some of these things are just almost just below the surface, so you don't always see them. They're not as obvious as, you know, some things. And, you know, basically I'm going to say how, you know, why should we care about these biological soil crusts? I'm going to use this abbreviation quite a bit. And, you know, I would say that, you know, this journey that I'm hoping I'm taking you on is somewhat intellectual of a journey, but it's really a kind of a hazardous journey because you'll never return to thinking about the desert the same, unfortunately. I'm sorry. But, you know, and I doubt if you'll ever really return safely to this haphazard, you know, big deal, you know. You're going to understand a little bit more why some of these things, you know, occur. Up in here, you see these sorts of, this is a nitrogen-fixing biological soil crust called Kalima 10X with reproductive structures in that. And, you know, it's critical in nitrogen fixing in the desert. So the awareness of biological soil crust is really, it's not really out there in the news like sage grouse, perhaps. Although, you know, maybe in my small circle of friends, it's a big news item, but they're really small, they're hard to see. I've gone out with other like scientists and show them these things, and they often say to me, oh, that's it? That's them? They're so little, you know. I've been walking on those for years, but they don't look close enough to see them. Actually, some of these, like these mosses here, some of these mosses can be so small, and when they dry up, they're just dried up like this, and when they get moist, then they open and are more visible. And I sometimes have to look with a 10-power hand lens to even know whether it's a lichen or a moss. They're so small. And yet those things have rhizines that go into the soil, help bind that soil. And then, you know, so if you impact those at a small scale, you do it millimeter by millimeter. And it's really kind of a indirect effect, and it's also very kind of complex interactions. But basically, these complex interactions are determined by the degree of disturbance. That's what I mean by, you know, they tell you the history. I can go to sites, look at the crust, see if, for example, if a cow walks along slowly and compresses on the soil, the lichen can recover from those. In contrast, vehicles that do sheer force, and, you know, mountain bikes even, or motorcycles or vehicles, they create a much greater degree of disturbance and type of disturbance. You know, that pushing down compressional versus shear force pushing back disrupts all those crusts. And then post-disturbance, what kind of seed arrives after the site? Historically, you know, there weren't a lot of cheatgrass seeds or other exotic seeds that could be brought in by energy corridors. Yellow star thistle is one that we have in Idaho BLM that's really a problem. It's an annual that's very thorny and poisonous to horses. And now that we have these seeds, it's a whole new world. I sometimes talk about BC, not before Christ, but before cheat. And before cheatgrass, we didn't have as bad of a problem with this. But now the lichens kind of record this history. These are my picture of my boots years ago. Some of you might recognize those old, that type of boot from a activity years ago. And what really happens is you go from this kind of moss interspace, biological soil crusts and lichens, they get trampled out and you get this cheatgrass in there. This is what, some of the people have talked about in the earlier talks about spraying plateau to get rid of those annual cheatgrass, trying to recover this. And it's a very subtle difference. When this first happens, no one even notices it, or it doesn't go to 100% cheatgrass. It slowly converts. And energy-wise, energy production is more, they're more like a conduit of spreading weeds and cheatgrass. If you have a vehicle that stays on the road, and they have best management practices like speaker before me talked about, they might, best management practice might mean cleaning your utility vehicle before you go out and do maintenance on these sites to control new invaders of weeds. If you do something like that, it doesn't matter if you drive down that road a second time and stay on the road. But when these roads and access, if they don't stay on the road, if they cut corners, you've seen a lot of the energy development. It's like a spider web of roads out there. That causes much greater damage than if they stay on the established roads. And even how they develop those roads is a major factor. Anyhow, just different, like they reseed an area, but maybe yellow star thistle was part of the seed that was brought in accidentally in the reseeding. So those can be very critical, but cheatgrass is the most common hitchhiker. So let's look at those, and throughout the West, and we're kind of covering the whole West, we got other things besides cheatgrass. You got Medusa head on clay soils and other soils now. It's evolving where it's starting to grow on non-clay soils. Red brome in some of the West. Let's see where my brome is. And then ripgut brome, one that I find in like southern Utah is quite common. So these things are replacing these biological soil crust surface and growing in between the clumps, in between these. So you go from a structure that has bunch grasses here with biological soil crusts in between, which are mostly gone unnoticed. Like, unfortunately, a lot of these desired plant communities or the pristine communities that were well displayed earlier for, what was important or what's a desired plant community. What's the pristine community? You might have more biodiversity in the species of crust than in all the vascular plants in that site. So, you go from here with numerous species to a monoculture of crusts, of cheatgrass, and not only do you get this cheatgrass and degraded lands, you might have a few shrubs, sagebrush left in there, but mostly you've lost all that diversity and you've created a flammable condition. So you go from this kind of clumpy bunch grasses and shrubs to this, which picture I showed you before. This is quite common in the West. And dramatically or diagrammatically, you're going from the bunch grass to here. And really, livestock trampling is more important really than herbivory of the livestock. Often the livestock herbivory is not as major of a concern. Plants can handle being grazed at given times of the year, but the trampling is the impact. And yet, in range management, we've done very little to evaluate that trampling as far as rangeland health and other things. It's often kind of not even discussed or talked about. And yet I think the trampling is more important than the consumptive use. This definitely increases the fire hazard, and this leads from this to all this kind of crust in there. You get a little disturbance first, but it just keeps going. And these crusts really are evolved with these bunch grasses. They help improve the bunch grass growth because it kind of prevents soil splash, wind erosion, and it prevents weed growth. In here, all this biological soil crust cuts down on the percent germination of cheatgrass. It helps with infiltration, cools the soil, slows evaporation out of the soil. So here's an example with the biological soil crust. You see the cheatgrass seed perches on top, actually often germinates and dries up because you don't have long enough periods of moisture for it to penetrate the soil with the radicle. Done several experiments and published a few articles on this, and we find differences. Here's bare soil. You can get almost 100% germination. And on top of different kinds of mosses and crusts, you get anywhere from 20 to 5% germination only, just growing in the cracks in the crusts. So in a lot of ways, a decrease in our crust cover causes increase of weeds, and energy corridors are mostly just corridors for the weeds. So they create more edge effect, but good management practices, as mentioned by some of the groups, can help decrease that damage. Here you see a kind of nice pristine bunchgrass community, and it really creates a sense of place in the West. Just to show that, here's like an early artist version of the Snake River Plain. They show the sagebrush as very sparse and open. You don't always have that anymore in the West. The sagebrush densities are often too dense from historic or pristine sites. Because they graze out the grass and the biological soil crusts are trampled, the sagebrush densities increase. There are also corridors for off-road vehicles. Dust, I see there's some other talks on dust, so I'm going to move through that pretty quickly. But dust can actually cover up these biological soil, especially the lichens, and kill them. Dust storms are becoming more common with disturbance. And here's some of our less than pristine looking BLM areas. This is on top of a rare plant, sandy soil, and they put some water troughs in here, water haul sites that weren't necessarily approved, and they just trampled this area, and it becomes one big dust pit. Other thing with wind energy, it's often a good idea, but often in the wrong place. Our ridges and steep slopes are some of our pristine communities, some of the places that you can find relic and unique plants, and those are often impacted by wind energy. Wind projects have impacts year-round sometimes with maintenance and that, unlike seasonal grazing. If you notice, the trend in grazing is to not graze year-round anymore in arid systems, but to develop better grazing systems. The other thing I find in BLM is every company wants their own little corridor. They don't necessarily want to play in the same sandbox. And as a public utility, or public agency, I think, we're trying to. BLM went through a big process in Idaho to come up with the best suggested corridor. But a lot of the energy companies have a few of them have paid attention to that, but most of them have ignored it and just decide where they want to put their corridors and apply for energy in other places. Cheatgrass definitely changes that system, and these are some of the diversity of species you lose. Some of the studies they find in a given sagebrush steppe community, you have 26 species of biological soil crusts. compared to only about 14 species of vascular plants. Just kind of reiterating this whole disturbance, and this is what it goes to, just a bunch of cheatgrass. And so you find the gaps between the shrubs are just turning into cheatgrass when they should have been biological soil crusts. And that really impacts what's happening there. And I wanted to share that with you, and kind of take home message is don't bust the crust, whether that's through energy development using best management practices, and also just that idea that new invaders, new species are brought in by these roads in general, both roads for general management and by energy. So with that, I'll take any questions. Good question. So just rephrase that. Is fire impacting crusts? Yes. Usually fire, a lot of places, some of the crusts are damaged and gone before the fire occurs. But in a good condition site, fire can burn. And we have sites where it's 100% eliminated. And I guess it's the old version. The biologist's answer is it depends. The heat of the fire, the intensity, whether it burned at night when it's cool or whether it burned during the day, all those are related to the intensity of the fire. But if the intensity isn't too great, the crust can survive. One fire in particular, we had a fire near Cuna Butte, Idaho, where we did rehab of it with perennial grass, and we got a thick cover of mosses. About 15 years later, we had another fire burn through there. It burned pretty hot, burning the grasses, but it was more of a medium heat fire. And those mosses, about 90% of them returned. They're short moss. They didn't burn up. They kind of kept that sparse cover, big spaces between the bunchgrasses. And there was a real, some mosaic burn, and they survived the fire. I know I published an article on Hell's Canyon fire where the crust in good condition burned up a slope and didn't really change the percent cover of crust much. But generally speaking, the fire does damage the crust. Another question? So he was questioning restoration. I think pretty much if you build a clumpy structure of vascular vegetation, the lichens and mosses will come back in faster in the Great Basin than in the Colorado Plateau probably, because it's more moist in the winter. But we find that they can come back in pretty quickly, maybe 9 or 10 years for the mosses in the Great Basin. But you got to create that bunchy habitat. And a lot of our restoration tools determine that. Traditionally, the BLM has used a rangeland drill. And if that rangeland drill breaks up all the soil surface, it's pretty bad for the crust. There's very little recovery, and it causes cheatgrass. Great environment for cheatgrass, a rangeland drill. So these minimum impact drills like the Thru, the new drills where you punch holes in and you don't disturb the entire surface, those have much quicker recovery of biological soil crusts and better germination, of the seeded species. So it's the kind of catch-all. It depends on the type of restoration and how it's implemented.
Time for one more question?
So his question is, does BLM have after a disturbance, a requirement for biological soil crust? They don't really. BLM operates kind of state by state. Each state has different, standards and guides for rangeland management. And some of the states include biological soil crust as part of those. In Idaho, we include that as a kind of apple pie statement, kind of try to go back to that original desired vegetation type, and that would be a percentage of biological soil crust. But we don't really have a good rule of thumb. Mostly I just promote having established perennial grass or clump vegetation, and none of the other states that I know have a real good regulatory mechanism, a metric, if you might use the other speaker's term. It's hard to have metrics for biology. It would probably be beneficial, but I guess I would just say in my observation of rehabs, if you turn animals back on after 2 seasons of rest, that's not enough for biological soil crust. Where we've, for other reasons, waited 4 years or 5 years on dry habitats, arid systems, we have much better success. Like that site where it burned a second time, we were grazing it now in the winter, but it recovered quite well after the fire because we had rested it almost 9 years before we put animals back out.